Hello, sci-fi and philosophy kiddos. Today is our second lecture for this course being done online. Today, I'm going to be responding to various students' comments and writings regarding Searle's essay and Star Trek's The Measure of a Man episode. I'll start off with that, maybe talking about that for 15 or 20 minutes, and then I'll go on to talk about something you should have read, and you should have seen my outline on William Lycan's article. And also, I want to start out today with some announcements, and you'll be getting an email with these announcements as well, but I thought I'd go ahead and put them online. So next Tuesday, right, there'll be another online lecture posted. In preparation for that online lecture, I'd like for you to read John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism. We have an excerpt from John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism in our textbook. I want you to just read page 645 to 648 in Mill. I will also send you a scanned copy of a writing by James Rachels where he talks about Mill's utilitarianism. I want to point out that Group B students, hopefully you guys know who you are in Group B. Group B students should submit a reflection piece critically engaging with the material from Lycan and his article, Robots and Minds. Certainly you can use the idea from my lecture and outline for that as well. I will respond to the Group B essays in my lecture next Tuesday. I will go on to discuss John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism and Rachel's thoughts on utilitarianism next Tuesday in my next lecture. Also, all of you should know that all of you have papers that are due on Friday, April 10th. That's a week from tomorrow. Those can be submitted electronically as attachments to email. I hope to grade those on the weekend on April 11th and 12th. Having said that, let's now go ahead and talk about student comments on Star Trek's episode, The Measure of a Man, and John Searle's essay. I'm going to try and respond to 3 or 4 students' comments. I think I'll start out with something Jesse Cagle wrote. Jesse Cagle wrote, and I'll quote a little bit from Cagle's essay. Cagle wrote, after reading Searle's Minds, Brains, and Programs, Searle's view on the Star Trek episode would be that properly programmed artificial intelligence is a mind that can understand and thus possess cognitive states. In other words, know things, such as in the Star Trek episode, Data is not human, but Searle and Picard would believe that Data is a living thing. Cagle also says, Searle's reason for thinking computers can have consciousness is that computers process information, and so do human beings. So if you regard thought as mere information processing, then computers think, such as in the Chinese room case from Searle's Minds, Brains, and Programs. There's no understanding involved in understanding of concepts. It's not simply behavioral responses. So computers can think and respond the same. Jesse, I think the position you take here is very hard to defend. When you say that that Searle's reason for believing that computers can think, you say, is that computers process information and so do human beings. It's important to understand that, Searle thinks that there's a lot more to having consciousness and thought than just processing information. I mean, that is what's fundamental to the Chinese room argument, right? In the Chinese room argument, there's processing of information going on, but the man in the room who's receiving the Chinese input and then giving appropriate Chinese responses, the man in the room doesn't understand the information coming in. The man in the room doesn't understand the information going out. And so there's really no understanding being expressed there. There's no understanding, no conscious awareness of what's being done in the Chinese room example. And Searle wants to say that digital computers operate in a similar fashion. And so digital computers don't express understanding in what they do. And this means that if data is operating in accordance with digital computer programming, then data won't have understanding or consciousness on Searle's view, and data won't be a person. So I think it's very hard Jesse, to defend the reading that you're giving to Searle here. And to go further with this, I would draw attention to some things that Searle says, and by drawing attention to this may be of use to other students in the class. And Jesse, I'm grateful that you said this because it invites opportunity for further clarification. But I'm looking at page 403 of our essay from Searle. Searle writes, "Could a machine think?" Searle says the answer is obviously yes. We are precisely such machines, we human beings. Searle writes, yes, but could an artifact, a man-made machine, think? Searle says, assuming it is possible to produce artificially a machine with a nervous system, neurons with axons and dendrites and all the rest of it sufficiently like ours, again, the answer to the question seems to be obviously yes. If you can exactly duplicate the causes, you could duplicate the effects. Notice what's going on here. I mean, for Searle, the capacity for thought and understanding and consciousness, for Searle, it really hinges on having a machine that is so much like our brain, that involves axons, dendrites, things that are biological aspects of the human make and fabric. Also, towards the end of Searle's essay at page 406, Searle writes, again, he raises the question, could a machine think? And Searle says, this is Searle, my own view is that only a machine could think, and indeed only very special kinds of machines, namely brains and machines that have the same causal powers as brains. And that is the main reason strong AI, strong artificial intelligence, has had little to tell us about thinking, since it has nothing to tell us about machines. Searle goes on and says, whatever else intentionality is, it is a biological phenomenon, and it is as likely to be as causally dependent on the specific biochemistry of its origin as lactation, photosynthesis, or any other biological phenomena. So again, Searle's actually very pessimistic. Excuse me, I dropped something. But Searle's very pessimistic about the prospects of any artificial man-made machine ever being able to express understanding, to have consciousness. Searle's inclined to think that this is probably just a biological phenomenon, and for something to be able to understand and have consciousness, it would have to function in very, very similar ways, and structurally, the organization of any conscious and understanding and knowing being would have to be so structurally similar to us biologically, especially with respect to its neurology, that we have very good reason to think, on Searle's view, that something like data would not be a person with consciousness. So that's my response to Kegel's writing. Let's take a look at what Mitchell Dvorak wrote. Here's a quote from Dvorak. It'll be a fairly long quote. Mitchell Dvorak writes, I believe Searle would have a more difficult time with this trial the more he learned about data, because in the end, yes, data is a machine and running based on code. This is Data from the Star Trek episode. Data also shows many traits of humanity, and on more than one occasion has shown understanding. So in the end, even though it goes against Searle's argument, the more Searle learned about Data and what his existence has consisted of, the more likely he would be to rule on the side of the captain and Data. But without past knowledge, Searle would rule against Data. Without knowledge, Searle would say that he lacks personhood and rights, but the more he learned, the more into the gray area you would go. This is kind of interesting. Mitchell Dvorak thinks that Searle would, initially maintain, right? If the question is raised to John Searle, is Data from Star Trek's The Measure of a Man episode, if Searle, right, according to Dvorak, if Searle was initially asked, is Data a conscious being, a person with rights? Dvorak's point of view is that, well, if initially asked that question, Searle would say no, because Searle's a man-made machine that operates in accord with programming. But Mitchell Dvorak wants to say that, but if only, Mitchell Dvorak seems to want to suggest that if only Searle knew more about the life and times and behavior of Data over time, then Searle would probably come to a different conclusion, and Searle would probably say Data is a conscious, aware person with rights. If only Searle knew more about the life and times and all the things that Data has done. But I'm not so sure Searle would go there, because I think in the end, Searle, think about the way I responded to Jesse Cagle. Searle thinks that it's very important what the material structures are that give rise to behavior in an organism, and if the structures don't very, very, very closely mimic biological structures, then then on Searle's view, there's probably not consciousness and understanding involved. And the problem is that Data, the material structures are quite and significantly different, and so Searle, if he knew more about the behavior of Data, and all of the conversations Data is engaged in, and Data's, say, having formed close relationships or romantic relationships with others, I think Searle might say, well, a computer could be programmed to act for all the world as though it loves. A computer or a robot could be programmed to act for all the world as though it's got significant understanding. A computer might be programmed to write love letters and things like this. But again, on Searle's view, if it's just acting in those ways, that's not good enough for consciousness and understanding. And so I think Searle might well stick to his guns, and Searle might just say that, well, while Data acts for all the world as though he's a conscious being, that's not enough. So I I think I think that's what Searle would say in answer to Mitchell, to what you're pushing here. That's certainly what I would, obviously, is what I would want to say in speaking in Searle's behalf. Let's look at something else. Here's something from Sean Bowman. Sean Bowman has submitted something. I'll briefly read something from Sean Bowman. Bowman writes at the end of his essay, he says, I believe that Data, from the Star Trek episode, I believe that Data does have personhood and rights because the most important impulse of the spirit is the fear of death. And in the episode, Data refuses his dissection because he will not be able to be reassembled, and it would result in his death. His refusal shows that impulse to remain alive, and that means he is conscious. Okay. Bowman, I like the spirit of this, but in the end, I don't think that's going to work. If I'm Searle, there's going to be a couple of things that I'll want to say about this. Um, Look, I think first of all, one of the things is um, right. So again, Bowman, you say that the most important impulse of the spirit is the fear of death, right? Data, since he refuses to be taken apart for inspection, that would result in his death. Data showing fear of death, but um, it, there are lots of non-human animals that we don't typically regard as persons that exhibit fear of death. And so just exhibiting a fear of death, it doesn't seem to suffice for establishing personhood. Um, right? Um, Cows and sheep and pigs might exhibit fear of death, but we don't regard them as persons with rights. Rather, we kill them and eat them. Now, you might push back there. You might, want to push back and say, well, if they exhibit that fear of death, they are persons. And you might want to defend ethical vegetarianism or something on those grounds. But here's something else as well. There's something else. Maybe this point will run a little bit deeper. Um, it could be that Data, while he wants to avoid being destroyed, or while Data acts in such a way as to avoid his own destruction. Um, well, it could be that Data has no fear of death. He might not even have an understanding of death. It could be that Data just operates on a program, and the program might be designed, and he might be programmed in such a way that he will act to avoid his own destruction. But just because a robot is programmed to act in such a way as to avoid its own destruction, it doesn't necessarily mean that the robot has a fear of death. It doesn't even necessarily mean that it understands what its own destruction would amount to. So it could just be that Data is programmed and has no understanding of his own demise, um, and maybe has no internal psychological state of fear and has no understanding of his own demise. But there are programs that he's been endowed with that make him avoid his being destroyed. Um, and and just because a being operates in such a way that it avoids its own destruction, I'm not sure that that means that it's a person. It seems to me, um, snakes might avoid their own destruction instinctively, but I hardly regard snakes as being um, persons, say. Um, so anyway, that's my reaction to the Bowman piece. Let's look at one more of these. Let's look at Vanessa Bone. Um, Here's a quote from Bone. Bone writes, I believe that Searle would argue that Data does not have a mind because he could potentially be mirroring human understanding according to his programming. Absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. Searle would argue that Data would not be a person and therefore should not have the same rights as a person. Now, Vanessa Bone goes on and says, one question I would like to raise with Searle's argument is how we know that a computer is not understanding the given stimuli as well as processing that stimuli in accordance to its programming. As humans, we react to stimuli in accordance to rules that have been set forth by ourselves and society, yet we still can understand the meaning of the stimuli. As computers can mirror brain functioning very well, how can we know that these computers do not function and understand the way a human brain can? This is interesting, and I think, Vanessa, I think you're showing some significant understanding of of Searle's essay. Um, and you do raise this interesting question. I want to go back to what Vanessa says here. Vanessa writes, one question I would like to raise with Searle's argument is how we know that a computer is not understanding the given stimuli as well as processing that stimuli in accordance to its programming. This goes back to, if I'm, when you think about what Searle says, I mean, I think Searle might be open to the possibility. Searle might be open to the possibility that data has consciousness uh, and understands and is a person. But Searle, in the end, is going to be, while he might be open to that possibility, I think it's fairly clear from his essay, he's going to be quite skeptical and I think Searle would think it's so improbable that data's got consciousness and understanding. And I think Searle's going to say it's so improbable because data is not made of the right sort of stuff. Data does not have the organic, biological brain of a human being. And without that, without axons, dendrites, neural connections crossing over the gray matter of our brain, Searle's going to be very doubtful that data is a person. And indeed, I think Searle would feel warranted in concluding that data is not a person and lacks consciousness, despite the fact that data might mimic consciousness in very, very significant ways. You see what I'm getting at? I mean, so that's my reaction, Vanessa, to what you've said there. And again, I hope in dealing with just a few student writings here, I hope I've been able to add some greater clarity to maybe what Searle's up to. I hope you guys have enjoyed thinking about these student comments as much as I have. Let's turn over to the William Lycan essay. Again, hopefully you've got the outline. Again, I would encourage you to have the outline open on one window in your computer and then have the video of my lecture going in another window. That way you can look at the outline as I'm walking through it. So, and I don't know how much I have to add to what's in my outline, but let's walk through this together for a while. So obviously William Lycan takes a very different position from that of Searle, and I think Lycan would say that data is a person, has consciousness, and has rights to life, liberty, etc. William Lycan considers an argument that digital computers exhibit intelligence. The argument runs as follows, and again, I'm working with my outline. 1. Intelligence is the ability to solve problems in response to contingencies, such as being able to find one's home to Cedar Rapids from Chicago. 2. An intelligent creature registers information, stores it, and uses it to solve problems. 3. Digital computers can do this. Therefore, digital computers are intelligent. By God, my cell phone seems to register information, store it, and it solves problems. When I'm lost in Chicago trying to find my way back to Cedar Rapids, I can put into my cell phone directions to Cedar Rapids, and it will solve that problem for me. So, digital computer does seem to be able to register information, store it, and solve problems. Now, there's a little argument for artificial intelligence and understanding. Lycan goes on to point out, I'm still looking at the first main part of my outline. Lycan says in reply to this that it may be argued that digital computers have no judgment because they have no goals of their own and no internal sense of appropriateness. Right? It could be argued that computers only do as they are programmed to do. Thus, we may question whether any digital computer is intelligent in the same way that a human is. right? So, right, just right. So, in other words, somebody might say that sure, um, right? Intelligent creatures register information, they store the information, and they can use that information to solve problems. And somebody might say, sure, a computer can do all of that, but still, a computer um, isn't intelligent and isn't a personhood or doesn't have personhood because computers set no goals for themselves. They make no judgments of what's worthwhile or what's worth doing for their own. Rather, the computer gets its goals and gets all of its values from the programmer who programs the computer and provides the computer with its goals. And the computer exerts no judgment on how it shall live its life or how it shall operate. And somebody might want to say, if the computer doesn't set its own goals and set an agenda for its own living, then it's really not a person and not intelligent in the ways that a human being is intelligent. So, that initial argument can be challenged, according to Lycan. Now, Lycan goes on to talk about Harry the robot, and he wants to use Harry the robot to say some things about the prospects for robotic computers and artificial intelligence to be persons. Lycan says, imagine there is a humanoid robot named Harry. Harry, the humanoid robot, can play golf, can play the viola, can write poetry, can make love, etc. But would doing all of this make Harry a person with rights to life, liberty, and property? William Lycan suggests that to be a person, the robot Harry must be conscious. Right? To say he must be conscious, he must have understanding of his environment, himself, his surroundings, etc. Lycan suggested to be a person, the robot Harry must be conscious. Then Lycan says, how do we determine whether a being is conscious? Lycan says that if a being such as Harry behaves in all the same ways that we would expect of a conscious being like ourselves, then we have some reason to think the being is conscious. Right? So I think at a certain level, what Lycan is getting at here is that at a certain level, while Lycan doesn't talk in these ways, but I think at some level what Lycan is suggesting is that each one of us, myself, right, Beck Peterson, Katja Richter, Jonah Beck, whoever, each one of us is immediately aware of our own understanding and consciousness, right? And so when we encounter other human beings who respond to the world and behave in ways that are similar to the ways that we behave, and given that we know ourselves to be conscious, we've got good reason to believe that a being that acts in very similar ways to ourselves must be conscious as well, right? Right, and so, and also I take it the idea here is that, well, if I know that I'm conscious, and if I respond to the world in certain sorts of ways, and I think what Lycan might be suggesting is then if I encounter a robotic computer that responds to the world in ways very similar to the ways that I do or other human beings do, then I'm going to be justified in assuming that that robotic being has consciousness as well. Now, I'm going back to the handout. I'm still looking at the Harry the Robot and Personhood section. Lycan goes on and says that none of this proves that Harry is conscious because Harry could just be simulating consciousness. That's certainly a concern that Searle has. But Lycan goes on and says, nonetheless, this does give us good reason to think of Harry as conscious or to treat him as conscious. Lycan would want to say that to exclude Harry the robot from the realm of persons just because he is made of different material and just because he has no biological mother and father, this is just a kind of discrimination, like racism or sexism, right? Right? I mean, I think in large measure what Lycan is suggesting is that look, it's self-evident to me that I've got consciousness, and I respond to dangers, and I respond to affection, and I respond, and I can figure out how to get home from Chicago, and I know how to cook meals, and I know how to ride a bicycle. Well, if there's right, right, and it's just self-evident to me that I'm consciousness and that I can do all those things in the appropriate ways. And when I see other human beings doing those things in the appropriate ways, I'm justified in assuming that they're conscious. Well, so too, if I see a robot that fears being kicked and avoids being kicked and punched, that responds politely to those who show affection towards him, who can ride a bicycle, who can find out how to get home from Chicago. If I encounter a robot who responds to the world in all the same ways that I do and other human beings do, and if I'm warranted in thinking that the other human beings are conscious, then on Lycan's view, I'm warranted in assuming or treating the robotic artificially intelligent being as conscious as well, right? And to fail to treat a robotic human being, such as Data, as though Data has consciousness and personhood, it would be like racism or sexism. It would be like refusing to treat, somebody of a different race as a person just because they're from a different race, right? We could call it, this kind of discrimination, robotism or something, robotism or something. And, Lycan develops this point further. He goes on to give additional support for his position. And again, I think his position is quite clearly would suggest that on his view, Data should be treated as though Data is a person with consciousness, even though maybe we can't be sure that he's a person with consciousness. I think Lycan's view is that we have as much reason to think Data is conscious as we do other human beings. And he uses the example of Henrietta to help support his point here. The Henrietta example, this is the example where you've got a human being. In fact, I'll go to the text here, page 409 to 410. Oh, where is it? Right, Lycan 409, right-hand column, Lycan talks about Henrietta. Lycan writes, my argument can be reinforced by a thought experiment. Imagine that we take a normal human being, Henrietta, and begin gradually replacing parts of her with synthetic materials. First a few prosthetic limbs, then a few synthetic arteries, then some neural fibers, and so forth. Right? Notice how he's talking about you've got a human being, and slowly we're replacing this human being's parts, and we even replace parts of the brain with synthetic neural fibers. Suppose that the surgeons who perform the successive operations are so clever and skillful that Henrietta survives in fine style. Her intelligence, personality, perceptual acuity, poetic abilities, etc. remain just as they were before. But after the replacement process has eventually gone on to completion, Henrietta will have become an artifact. Will have become completely man-made. At least her body will then be nothing but a collection of artifacts. Did she lose consciousness at some point during the sequence of operations, despite her continuing to behave and respond normally? When? It is hard to imagine that there is some privileged portion of the human nervous system that is for some reason indispensable, even though kidneys, lungs, heart, and any given bit of brain could, in principle, be replaced by a prosthesis. And it is also hard to imagine that there is some proportion of the nervous system such that removal of more than that proportion causes loss of consciousness or sentience despite perfect maintenance of all intelligent capacities. It is this If this quick but totally compelling defense of Harry and Henrietta's personhood is correct, then the two and their ilk will have not only mental lives like ours, but moral lives like ours, and moral rights and privileges accordingly. Right? So, Lycan, again, he suggests a situation where imagine that robotic and computer scientific technologies have advanced such a way that you have a woman, Henrietta, who's a human being, and imagine she's slowly dying of some disease, but we can replace her parts, including neural parts, with synthetic man-made materials. And imagine that this gradual replacement of all her parts, she just continues to act and behave in the ways that we've always associated with Henrietta's person. And there's no loss of consciousness, and she continues to recognize her husband and her children and respond to her husband and children in all the same ways. Lycan wants to suggest, and there seems to be something to this, that we should probably then treat Henrietta as though she continues to live and exist, and treat her as a person with rights and dignity. It's a very interesting thought experiment, and I think it has some teeth, actually. Now, having said all that, somebody still might object and say, man-made, artificially intelligent machines, robots, the completely regenerated Henrietta with all new synthetic parts still cannot be a person. Right? How might one object and argue for this? Lycan looks at a couple of objections and responds to them in the later parts of his essay. The first objection runs something like this. Right, here's an objection to Lycan's position that that a properly programmed AI could be a person with rights. Somebody might argue, point one, right, so I'm down to the objections and replies. Somebody might argue, point one, computers only act in accord with their programming. The programming determines their behavior. Therefore, they lack the free will characteristic of persons. Therefore, computers cannot be persons. Lycan responds to this in the following manner, and this will be overly brief. Maybe I can develop it a bit. But Lycan's response is that if free will is compatible with causal determinism, as many philosophers believe, then this is not a good objection. And Bill Lycan, he is a compatibilist about free will. And what Lycan is getting at here is that, again, right, determinism, this is the view that everything that happens in the universe is necessitated by prior states and events, right? And on the deterministic worldview, and we talked about all of this in class before, right? On the deterministic worldview, even human choices and decisions and actions would be determined by prior states and events. So, for instance, everything I'm saying right now would presumably, on the deterministic worldview, be the result of necessitating factors in the neurology of my brain lead me to say what I'm saying now. And those neural states were necessitated by neural states antecedent to that, and neural states antecedent to those other states, and going backwards in time. Right? And somebody might want to say that computers, they do what they do as a necessary consequence of their interaction with the environment and the programming that's been bestowed upon them by their programmer. And if everything that the computer does is just a consequence of the environment they're in and the programming given to it by the computer programmer, well then artificially intelligent machines would lack free will and not be persons. But I think what Lycan's going to want to say is something like this. I think what Lycan's really suggesting is that, look, but human beings just act in deterministic ways as well. Human beings, no, human beings are not programmed by computer programmers, but I think what Lycan's suggesting is that human beings are just, our brains are necessitated to operate in the ways that they do, right? By the complex interplay of genetic and environmental factors shaping our neural functioning in such a way that we do what we do as a result of the complex interplay of genetic and environmental factors. And so, in this sense, human behavior is likely just necessitated in all the same ways that computer behavior is necessitated. And on Lycan's view, what makes us free is when our actions are caused by states internal to our minds or our neural functioning, right? And so, for instance, if what I'm saying now is a product of my own desires, what I'm saying is done of my own free will, and that's going to be true even if my desires that necessitate what I'm saying are the product of neural processing in my brain. But so too, a robot that operates on its program in accordance with its programming, it too will be acting freely then. And so, on Lycan's view, the mere fact that robots are determined in their behavior by their programming really doesn't make them any different from human beings. Human beings can be free even if we're determined by the programming of the genetic and environmental factors. Well, so too, a robot can act freely even if it's programmed by a programmer. And so, Lycan really is inclined to want to say that robots can have free will even if they're programmed. So here's a second objection. Somebody might say that without a nervous system like that of human beings, a computer's experience of the world won't feel like ours does. Therefore, for instance, when a robot feels sad, it won't feel sad in the way that we do. So robots are not persons. This objection really reminds me a lot of Searle, right? Because remember, Searle has this view that personhood and consciousness really, to a large extent, hang upon having neural structures that are very, very similar to the neural structure of biological human beings, right? And again, so the argument here is without a nervous system like that of human beings, a computer's experience of the world would not feel like ours does. So, for instance, when a robot feels sad, it won't feel sad in the way that we do. Therefore, robots are not persons. Lycan's reaction to this seems to be something like this. There's no good reason to think non-biological beings cannot have the same feelings that we have. So if a robot acts in all the ways we associate with being sad, we should assume that it feels sad, right? Suppose somebody told Data that someone with whom he's had long-standing close relations has died. And now Data, maybe Data's programmed to emit tears and cry. And imagine Data cries. Imagine Data, becomes lethargic in his behavior for the next month. Data doesn't want to get together with his other friends. Data just wants to stay home. Data cries when Data's at home. Imagine that these things transpired. I'm not saying that Data on Star Trek cries. I don't recall whether he does, but imagine that he was programmed to respond in these sorts of ways. to stay at home and not associate with others after hearing of the death of a human being with whom he's had close relations for many years. In other words, imagine Data's exhibiting all the behaviors that we associate with sadness. Um, well, um, Lycan's view is that um, we should, while we cannot, I guess Lycan's going to say, while we cannot know that Data, we cannot know for sure that Data is sad, and that perhaps he's just simulating sadness. Um, I think Lycan's view is that we should regard him as though he's sad and treat him as though he's sad. And I think Lycan's view is going to be, because after all, you know, when other human right when other human beings exhibit those sorts of behaviors, we take them to be sad because we know from the first person point of view, when we act those ways, that we've got that feeling. And so when I see other human beings crying and disassociating from their friendships, I assume that that person's enduring a sadness. And on Lycan's views, shouldn't I assume that there's the sadness in the robot as well? Maybe there's something to that. I would also point out here, another move that Lycan could make here is that, and maybe maybe this is on Lycan's mind, but I don't recall. But it seems to me another move that Lycan could make here is that just because, we might just think about human beings. Some human beings might have abnormal biological neural functioning. Um, and you could imagine a human being that had abnormal neural functioning, such that perhaps there's a human being um, who doesn't have the normal feeling of sadness when they find out that they've lost a loved one. Um, Maybe such a human being may not feel as you or I do when we've heard that we've lost a loved one. But that person may nonetheless engage in behaviors that we typically associate with sadness, um, but may not feel that sadness in the way that the rest of us do. Now, if that happens, should we regard that human being as a non-person or as lacking consciousness? I don't think so. I think that human being who's got an abnormal uh, response to the loss of loved ones would still be a person and have rights to life, liberty, and could still have consciousness, even if it's got some abnormal emotional responses and or abnormal internal feelings. It doesn't seem to me that it would rob the being of personhood or consciousness. And so, keeping that in mind, a robot that maybe doesn't feel the world in the ways that a human being normally does doesn't seem to me to rob that robot of consciousness or personhood. Um, right? Um, so anyway, in a way, maybe I've added a second kind of response to what on our outline is the second objection here. Um, I hope you guys have enjoyed this discussion of Lycan. Hopefully it's been useful. Group B, I will want you to develop short writing in reaction to the Lycan material. I will send you all an email with the instructions for next Tuesday. You'll get that email perhaps tomorrow or perhaps later today. I hope this has been useful. Take care out there. Good day. Bye-bye.